Welcome to Short Course, episode 140 for February 22nd, 2025. I'm your host, Ben Barry. As I'm recording this, it's Saturday night, 2 days before the February board meeting, and I wanted to cover the agenda items there, in particular, two of them related to transparency and confidentiality, because I think, as is often the case, the intent and the reality are sort of being misunderstood. And so I wanted to go through the thought process, how we got here, and hopefully where we can end up. So on the agenda, as I mentioned, there are two motions. One that is a motion for censure against Area 2 John Burt, and another one that is a confidentiality policy. And that policy is, there's a little more history behind the scenes than might be clear. One of the things that was going on last year, one of the things that I was advocating for and have been advocating for is that the confidentiality policy we have right now is not good. It's something that historically each director each year was asked to sign this policy, and it was written by I don't know by who, by some previous lawyer. We actually, I don't know that any of us know at this point. It's sort of one of these hand-me-down documents. Everybody who was here when it was written is gone. And if you want to read this policy, you can, it's on the website. It's on at uspsa.org/policies under Board of Directors policy. And you can see for yourself. It is not as clear as it could be. The only thing it really clearly calls out is membership info, but it basically makes statements about receiving information in the course of your work on the board and that sort of thing, but it doesn't really clearly define what is and isn't covered by the confidentiality policy. And a lot of us identified that as a problem. How do we know whether a given piece of information is confidential or not? And what can we share? And for example, in the new bylaws, when John rewrote Section 10.2, which right now stipulates that all financial information, employee information, membership lists, and similar matters of this corporation shall remain confidential. So the big sticking point there being financial information. I don't think it's really controversial that when you sign up for USPSA, that isn't necessarily a public record. If you have a membership, but you don't publicize that anywhere, then that is, part of that membership list. But basically, the issue is the keeping of financial information confidential. Now, it does also say that no officer or director shall supply copies or disseminate such confidential information to any third party without the written consent or by resolution of the board of directors, except as otherwise provided in these bylaws. So basically, by majority vote, we can deem financial information not confidential, and so we can release financial reports, but basically, by default, everything financial is confidential. And that's something that is changed in the new bylaws, where financial information is not automatically confidential. But to bring things back around to the confidentiality policy, this is something that I had reservations about signing when I came onto the board, and I also had reservations about us asking other people on the board to sign, especially the way it was done historically before with the previous managing director, where every director was asked to re-sign it each year, even if they had signed it previously the year before. That's my understanding. I only signed it the one time in 2024, but we were working with our Delaware attorney at the time to revise this as a part of the concerns that John Burt, then elected as Area 2, but not yet serving on the board, also had about its vagueness and difficulty in enforcing. But unfortunately, due to his interactions with John Burt, our Delaware lawyer declined to be our lawyer anymore. And so that has left us in this sort of gray area where it's not, we still have no clear resolution on what is and isn't confidential. The other thing that's worth discussing is the way the board agenda gets put together. And these two topics will come together in a second. So historically, we've well, until the bylaws were changed last year, the agenda had to be posted 10 days before the meeting. I actually advocated to have that moved to 7 days so that basically board members had the weekend before the meeting, since meetings tend to happen on Mondays. You had to have your agenda items in by the Monday before the meeting instead of the Friday before the meeting. So basically you could get agenda items submitted and the president would put together the agenda and get it posted on Monday. One of the things that Jim Boone, Area 1 vice president, interim president, has done is to sort of streamline this process is he created a shared document where we can just add our agenda items to that document and then he'll sort of review it versus emailing him things and then he puts together the document the way the previous president did. And again, typically the focus on that is in the week, the range between 2 weeks and a week leading up to the meeting is when most of the agenda items come in. In this case, 3 weeks before the February meeting, John Burt, as anybody who's on his newsletter has seen, took that document, added a bunch of agenda items to it, and then downloaded it and sent it out with all of the USPSA letterhead and formatting details and everything, which to me indicated that this was not just John Burt's motions, but this was the draft agenda, which to me was giving an unclear picture of what the board was actually doing. This was taking an internal board working document before it had been actually worked all the way through, basically an in-progress document, downloading it and distributing it, which to me seemed like not abiding by the principles of the confidentiality policy. Now, this is where the gray area comes in. I thought this was over the line. I talked to some other board members. They thought it was over the line. And the problem is, I don't want to come across as being the guy who's always butting heads with John. And so I talked to some of the other board members and I said, okay, let's just put a motion on the agenda to censure him for this. If we all think it's wrong, we'll just have a recorded vote, say, hey, we think this was wrong. And then the members can see. The motion for censure has no binding meaning. It doesn't strip John of any privileges, any powers. It is literally just a statement in the minutes that says, this happened and we disagree with it. We think it crossed this line. Now, along with that, and this is where the second motion in there with the confidentiality policy is a vote to basically clarify the confidentiality policy and state that working documents and internal board emails, defined as an email where all the recipients are board members, those are confidential. And this, I think, is a normal and necessary part of board deliberations. A group like the board of USPSA or the board of any nonprofit needs to have space to discuss in private things that put forward ideas that maybe they wouldn't want to defend publicly, to have that discussion and be able to throw out ideas. Just to take an example that everybody knows we're talking about, the policy around how to handle transgender individuals signing up for the lady category. There have been a lot of ideas that have been thrown around, and I think it is a benefit. I think people are more willing to speak their mind and more willing to come up with ideas, even ideas they might not agree with, but things to put forward as a straw man. People are more willing to do that when they understand that this is in the context of a discussion that won't just be screenshotted and shared publicly. So for everyone over the years who's talking about, oh, the USPSA board is just a bunch of know-nothing trigger pullers, we need more serious business people on the board. To be honest, if someone who had board experience came in and thought that at any moment, any email, any internal board email could be screenshotted and taken out of context and posted on social media, that would be a red flag to anyone, my understanding is, who has experience interacting with sort of functional professional boards. And so the distinction that I want to draw here is that this is not the goal of this is not to backslide against transparency. The goal here is just to establish where that line is, because I think clearly the current confidentiality policy is overly vague. I think different board members think and have different understandings of where that line is. And so the purpose of these two motions is just to clarify the understanding at a place that I think is a pretty reasonable one, right? Emails entirely within the board, so from board members to board members with no members involved. We're not trying to say, in fact, John's original rewrite of the bylaws actually included some verbiage about any email where one participant is a board member is confidential. And that obviously had this issue of, well, if a member writes into a board member, that doesn't need to be confidential. It's discussion within the board or working documents within the board. So if a committee is working on a report, but it has not been submitted to the board yet, the submitted version, if it's part of the package, if it's going into the minutes, that obviously is meant to be public, unless it is something that needs to remain confidential, such as, say, a discipline committee report where the names are, especially of people, reporting issues, that kind of thing, are being kept confidential. So that's what's going on there. Is I still believe the board needs to be more transparent about what we're doing, about the decisions that we actually are making, the reasons we're making them, the finances of the board. But there needs to also be this sort of carve out for the board to have these discussions. And, for example, I had one conversation via email with a member who basically said, no, the board should not have anything private. All emails should be open to inspection. All documents should be public. The board has basically no right to privacy, as though we're, prisoners in a jail where, we can just have our stuff turned over at any time. And I don't think that is a realistic standard, because let's say all USPSA.org emails are available for inspection at any time to the members. If somebody wants to discuss something, they're going to do it on a phone call. Well, now does every phone call where there are two more board members have to be recorded and posted to some Dropbox? People are, if USPSA email is no longer confidential, if Dropbox is no longer confidential, then things that people want to keep off the record until it's ready to present, they'll just move somewhere else. And you can say, well, that should be controlled. But again, let's go back to this example. If I just call another board member and we talk on the phone, if there's no confidentiality, do we have to record that? It just, if you sort of take that path to its logical extent, you just end up with sort of finding ways around it. And so I think just simply allowing board members to use email and Dropbox, which are our two primary tools for asynchronous collaboration, which is what most of us are doing, because very rarely are all of us online at the same time to be able to work on something at the same time. Having a clear delineation for where we are working in a confidential environment, in a sort of working environment, and then once the work product is done, then it gets presented to the membership. That does not seem radical to me. Now, all of that said, the point of the motion for censure was to record not my feelings, but record the opinion of the board, and to let each board member record whether they agreed or disagreed with the actions in this case. And it's entirely possible that the motion will fail, and the rest of the board thinks I'm just being silly about this whole thing, and it's not that big of a deal, and they vote the motion for censure down. That's possible. And the goal here is to, again, with the policy, clarify the lines, with the motion for censure, clarify where the boundaries are. And I'm not trying to sit on my high horse and say I'm perfect either. I'm keenly aware of the fact that on this podcast, I try to say as much as I can without breaking confidentiality, which to me primarily is attributing specific beliefs or words or actions to specific people. So if I say the board is discussing the transgender policy, again, we've been getting a lot of emails. We haven't made a formal statement about it, but I think it's generally well understood. The board is discussing that. Now, if I said board member X thinks Y, and that's not something that some view that they've made publicly, to me, that's over the line. And so I don't do that kind of thing. But I understand that I am trying to balance those things. I am walking that line. And if I say something on the podcast that somebody thinks is breaking confidentiality, by all means, bring a similar motion against me or reach out to me in person. And again, maybe this is crossing that line, but I did reach out to John about this and tried to basically address this. And he didn't seem to think it was a big deal the way that I did. He didn't seem to think it was a problem. And so that's how the motion for censure came about. It was something where I tried to resolve it one-on-one. That did not work. That did not seem to have any effect. And so I thought, okay, let's get the board on record about this and go from there. At the end of the day, the fact that I've already spent 15 minutes and there's been ink spilled on social media about it is really more than I wanted from it. Again, the idea here is we're almost forming the case law, because these confidentiality policies, they're not enforced by a judge unless it's something really egregious. They're not enforced by the discipline committee. They're not enforced by NROI. At the end of the day, it's up to the board to basically police ourselves. We say, this is our policy, and if somebody violates it, this is what we're going to do. Now, obviously, the most recent example was removing Scott Arnberg under 7-7 in December of 2023. And that is absolutely not what I'm talking about doing here with John. It is the furthest thing from my mind to call for him to be removed for sending out this one document. I appreciate the point that it was primarily his motions, but I do think putting it on the USPSA letterhead changes the format of it. If I write down a bunch of my ideas and email it out and say, hey guys, this is what I'm thinking, that's one thing. If I put it on USPSA letterhead or the White House letterhead, that changes the nature of the document, in my opinion. The board might disagree with me, they might agree with me, but that's the point of having the recorded vote. Honestly, I don't know how much discussion we'll end up having during the meeting. I kind of hope it's not that much. I think everybody kind of has their idea of the situation. Make the motion, vote on it, move on. Now, if there is some rich, fertile conversation to be had from that, by all means. But what I'm saying here is this motion is kind of putting a flag in the ground. I think this was too far. I welcome further flags being put on the ground, right? That's the point of these motions, is they're not really binding. They don't kick anybody off the board. They don't even strip someone of committee appointments or anything like that. The goal is just trying to, as a board, come together and build consensus on where we see the line is so everybody's on the same page. The other thing I did want to address, so just based on the feedback from last week's episode, or not last week, but the previous episode of Short Course, I spoke unnecessarily briefly on the topic of live streaming and posting the recording. And at the end of the day, my main concern at a functional level with the live stream is, under the previous president, the way that the live stream affected the meeting is all of the executive session topics were held to the end. And that was because basically there was one meeting where it was live streamed. We immediately went into executive session for an hour or two, which executive sessions shouldn't take that long fundamentally. But we did that, and people wrote in and they were pissed. They said, I tuned in. I didn't get to see anything. You guys need to stop hiding stuff. And so we changed it and we put all the executive session stuff at the end. Well, the problem with that is, in a lot of cases, the executive session stuff is time sensitive. It requires us to be fresh, not at the tail end of a meeting, which these meetings we've been holding to 3 hours, but under the previous president would run for 4 or 5 hours. And so having a 4-hour meeting and then at the very end having an hour of executive session with all the really substantial stuff, including things like discipline committee reports where we're deciding on what discipline to have based on the fact pattern presented, that was not a good pattern. And so I think as long as the understanding, and this is the way this month's meeting will be run and will be running going forward, is the meeting will be prioritized by what is time sensitive, what is urgent, what needs to be dealt with basically in priority order. So if there's some policy or some contract or some event that doesn't need to be resolved in the next few months, then we can wait on that. The classic example of that would be, if it's February now, the bylaws say that all competitor equipment changes are effective January 31st anyway, so there's really no point voting to put out a survey about some competitor equipment change when the earliest it would go into effect is 11 months from now. So that's something that, if it were put on the agenda, would be not particularly time sensitive and go to the bottom. Now, we have to make room for sort of the regular check-ins, the committee reports, the director reports, and that sort of thing. But the goal is put things on the agenda, and we'll get through all the things we can get through in our 3-hour time limit, because again, everybody's found that 4 or 5-hour marathon meetings just are not sustainable. And so it looks like, based on the agenda, we're probably going to end up ducking in and out of executive session 2 or 3 times. Now, so again, some of that is finances, which due to the current bylaws have to be confidential. Some of that is due to things like discipline committee findings, which again are handled in executive session. But that's the deal. Is as long as, if you watch the live stream, you understand the agenda is going to be in order of priority and urgency, and sometimes that means ducking in and out, and that might mean you tune in and then you see 45 minutes of a black screen. As far as I'm concerned, I think the live stream is fine. I don't, like I said in the last episode, I'm kind of ambivalent about it. I think it causes, and I'm guilty of some of this too, it causes a certain amount of grandstanding where maybe there's been some discussion among the board via email. We all kind of know where everybody stands. A motion comes up and we vote on it. Well, like I said, I'm guilty of this. I'm probably going to say something during the discussion period, right? So the motion is made, it gets a second, you go to discussion. I'm probably going to reiterate what I've said in private discussion, just so it's recorded on the live stream. So for whatever reason, if I'm voting for or against whatever it is, the live stream knows that. Where, again, if this is something that we've discussed via email beforehand, I probably wouldn't, because I know the other board members know where I stand on it. So there is a little bit of sort of extraneous time added, but I think on net, that is a useful way to communicate with the membership and sort of hear what their representatives are thinking, especially for the folks who don't have podcasts, which, right now it's just me and Andy, and even Andy is putting me to shame. I think I'm averaging a podcast every 4 weeks, and he does 2 every week, which just makes my head hurt. But that's the pros and the cons. I think, again, I'm fine with continuing to live stream. My position has been and will continue to be that if we're going to live stream, we should post a recording, just so that people who hear about something that happened on the live stream can go see it for themselves. We'll see how that shakes out, but that's what I think. That's if I were off the board, that's what I would want as a member. I would want the ability to tune in live if I have the opportunity, but also the ability not to have to do that and just to watch it later when I have the ability. I mean, I'm typically not one of these guys that watches live streams and all this. If I can catch the replay later, especially if I can watch it at 2x speed or whatever, and with the executive sessions, skip over those and all that. That would be my preference if I wasn't on the board. So I have no idea where the live streaming will go. I think either live streaming or recording or both will continue, but it'll be up to the board to sort of vote on what mix of the two or both we end up with. And just to end on a positive note, I do think the bylaws that have been revised, there's a motion on the agenda for this month in February to put out another draft, and I think this is going to be basically the pretty final draft. Obviously, read it over, give feedback. If you see something we're missing, something that needs to change, read over that, give us that feedback. We have the time to change it, but I think it looks like we're kind of on the path to adopt the new bylaws in March, and I'm looking forward to it. I think the new bylaws fix all the problems that we identified last year as a part of the bylaws committee, which, part of that has been taking that feedback and being included in this rewrite and having a chance to inject that feedback. But I do think those bylaws help clarify things. They move a lot of things that are in the bylaws that should be in policies, or that, things that are in the bylaws, like the managing director's job description is in the bylaws, which is, really that should be a policy. It should be a job description. The purpose of the bylaws is to basically define what the corporation is required to do, what we're allowed to do, and what we must not do. And so anything that's kind of a should or a recommend or anything like that really doesn't belong in the bylaws. The bylaws is sort of a contract between us and the shareholders, in this case, the members, to say, this is what we're not allowed to do. This is what, if we want to do this other kind of thing, this is what we, the number of votes we have to get to do it, that kind of thing. And then these are the things that we're mandated to do. And unless it's really one of those things, it doesn't necessarily need to be there. And so I think clarifying that, and for example, one of these things was the idea of removing the explicit call out for life memberships in the bylaws. The intent of taking out the explicit acknowledgement of 3-year, 5-year life memberships in the bylaws was, well, that's policy. That doesn't necessarily need to be in the bylaws. That's not something that is a sort of binding contract that we're making. But I could see the view from the members that, hey, want it to require the higher burden to change the bylaws if the board were ever to, for whatever reason, vote to take away life memberships. The majority required to change the bylaws is higher than the majority to change a policy, generally speaking, unless the policy defines it requires a higher level. But, let's say it's a 9-person board. Right now, in the current bylaws, to revise the bylaws requires a 3/4 majority. So that's 7 out of 9 votes. But a simple majority only requires 5 out of 9. And so I could see that idea that, hey, the membership says, hey, we don't trust you guys not to yank life memberships. Let's keep it in the bylaws so that at least if you do want to do it, you need 7 out of 9 votes, or the threshold as specified in the new bylaws, which is still higher than a simple majority. So I think we're nearly there. Like I said, there'll be a draft coming out. Let's please read over it, give feedback. There's still time to revise it, but I think it's 90% there. I think it's on a good track, and I think it is going to move the organization forward. So, well, that wraps up this episode of Short Course. If you need to get in touch with me, my email is ben@berryshooting.com. Talk to you next time.